The date is the autumn of 1944. A Japanese naval officer, a career man named Lieutenant Commander Itakura Mitsuma, stands at the edge of a concrete dock at the Otsushima Torpedo Training Base on the inland sea. He has spent 14 years in the Imperial Japanese Navy. He has studied at Etajima, the naval academy that modeled itself on Annapolis, and then decided Annapolis was not rigorous enough. He has memorized the writings of Admiral Togo. He has absorbed, at the cellular level, the naval doctrine that destroyed the Russian fleet at Tsushima in 1905 and humiliated the United States at Pearl Harbor in 1941. And now he is looking at something that 14 years of naval education have not given him a single category for. The object in front of him is a Type 93 Long Lance torpedo, Japan's finest naval weapon. 93 inches in diameter, over 9 meters long. It runs on pure oxygen, leaves no bubble trail, carries an explosive warhead of 490 kilograms, the most technically sophisticated torpedo in any navy in the world. He knows this weapon. He has studied it in detail. What he does not know how to categorize is the small hatch that has been welded into the body of this particular torpedo, the control column that has been fitted inside the warhead section, the periscope, the cramped cockpit barely large enough for a man to sit upright with his knees against the guidance panel. He knows what the hatch is for. He has just been told. A pilot will sit inside. The pilot will guide the torpedo to its target. The pilot will ride it to detonation. The pilot will not be coming back. Itakura stands at the dock for a long time. He does not write in his diary that night. Some things sit outside the reach of the language men use to record ordinary feelings. What he is looking at is called Kaiten. It means, in Japanese, turning the tide of heaven. The men who will pilot it are 20 years old on average. Some are younger. They have volunteered. Every single one of them has volunteered, in writing, multiple times, because the program initially rejected applicants to demonstrate that it was not taking anyone who had doubts. The program will produce 106 confirmed Kaiten missions. It will kill every pilot who completes one. It will sink, by verified count, 3 American ships. 3 ships. Against 106 pilots. That arithmetic is the beginning of a story that is not simply about sacrifice or fanaticism or a military program that failed by its own metrics. It is a story about what happens to a nation when the machinery of war outpaces everything else, when the institution meant to protect a people begins consuming them instead, and when young men of extraordinary quality are placed inside a system that has already decided they are expendable. It is the story of what the Kaiten program actually was, beneath the official mythology that sent those men into the water. And it begins, not with a weapon, but with a moment of institutional despair that the Imperial Japanese Navy spent the rest of the war trying to transform into something that looked like strategy. To understand the Kaiten, you have to understand what the summer of 1944 meant to the men who commanded the Imperial Japanese Navy. June 19, 1944. The Philippine Sea. What American pilots called the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, and what Japanese naval historians call, with rather more precision, the Battle of the Philippine Sea, lasted 2 days and destroyed something that could not be rebuilt. Japan lost 476 aircraft in those 2 days. It lost 3 aircraft carriers. But the number that mattered most, the number that the naval staff in Tokyo studied with a quality of attention that borders on grief, was the pilot count. Japan had entered the war with a corps of naval aviators who were among the finest in the world. These were men who had trained for years, some for a decade, who had accumulated thousands of flight hours, who had developed through repetition and experience a kind of airborne intuition that training manuals could not produce. They had struck Pearl Harbor. They had sunk HMS Prince of Wales and Repulse with horizontal bombing from altitude. They had fought at Midway and Coral Sea and Guadalcanal. By June 20th, 1944, most of them were dead. The new pilots Japan was producing to replace them were receiving in some cases 40 hours of total flight time before being assigned to combat units. American pilots at the same moment were receiving 300 hours minimum before their first operational mission. The gap was not a training gap. It was a civilizational gap, a difference between what Japan could produce and what the war now required, that no amount of institutional will could close in the time available. The naval staff understood this. They understood it with a clarity that does not appear in public documents, but exists in the private correspondence of officers who were doing the arithmetic. They had built one of the finest naval forces in history. They had used it to start a war with the most industrially productive nation on Earth. And now the compounding interest on that decision was coming due. The Kaiten was one answer to that arithmetic, not the only answer. Japan was simultaneously developing the Oka, a rocket-propelled piloted bomb carried beneath a bomber and released near the target. It was developing Shinyo, piloted explosive motorboats. It was reorganizing its entire force structure around the concept of Toko, special attack, which is the Japanese euphemism that American accounts translate as kamikaze. But the Kaiten was different from all of these in one specific way that matters for the story. A kamikaze pilot died in seconds. He dove. He struck. It was over. A Kaiten pilot sat inside a sealed metal tube, alone, for hours. He breathed recycled air. He watched his instruments in darkness. He had time, more time than any human being should have in those circumstances, to think about where he was going and why. What those men thought about during those hours is the center of this story. Because what they wrote beforehand, in letters to their families and in journals recovered after the war, is not what the official mythology of the Kaiten program wanted them to think. And it is not what most people, inside Japan or outside it, have been told they thought. The Kaiten program began with two men. Lieutenant Hiroshi Kuroki and Lieutenant Sekio Nishina were both torpedo specialists. Both had studied the long lance in detail. Both had arrived, independently, at the same calculation. In mid-1943, watching the trajectory of the Pacific War, they concluded that Japan's conventional submarine force would not be sufficient to reverse the naval balance. American anti-submarine technology was improving. Japanese submarines were losing the exchange. They submitted a proposal to Naval General Headquarters in February 1944. The proposal was for a manned torpedo that would use a human pilot to solve the guidance problem that limited conventional torpedoes. A long lance running on its standard guidance system had a miss rate against maneuvering targets that the program's proponents found unacceptable. A human pilot could correct for evasive action. A human pilot could choose the optimal impact point. A human pilot could guarantee the hit. The proposal was initially rejected. The naval staff in Tokyo in early 1944, before the Philippine Sea, still believed Japan could win the war by conventional means. Manned suicide weapons were, to the officers who reviewed the proposal, an admission of defeat before defeat had been confirmed. The Philippine Sea changed that calculation in 10 days. The program was approved in August 1944. Kuroki and Nishina began training the first group of volunteers at Otsushima. The training involved learning to pilot a modified long-lance torpedo in shallow water, practicing the approach, practicing the final dive toward a target marker on the bay floor. Kuroki died in a training accident in September 1944. His Kaiten flooded during a test run. His body was recovered from the cockpit. He was 26 years old. The program continued. Nishina carried his friend's ashes to sea on the first operational Kaiten mission, strapped inside a torpedo launched from the submarine I-47 on November 20th, 1944. His target was Ulithi Atoll, the massive American anchorage in the Western Caroline Islands. American logistical operations ran through Ulithi. The fleet oiler Mississiniwa sat anchored there, loaded with aviation fuel. Nishina's Kaiten struck the Mississiniwa. The ship burned and sank. 63 American sailors died. It was the most successful single Kaiten strike of the entire war. Nishina was 23 years old. The program's commanders studied the results and concluded they were looking at a viable weapon. They had sunk a significant vessel. They had demonstrated the concept was operationally sound. They began expanding the training program and modifying more submarines to carry the weapons. What they did not study with equivalent attention in those early weeks was what the program was actually costing in the currency that mattered most. Here is the thing that the official mythology of the Kaiten program required, and that the evidence does not entirely support. The mythology required volunteers who had transcended individual attachment. Men who had become, through the alchemy of national crisis and warrior culture and the philosophy of Bushido, something purer than ordinary soldiers. Men who had moved beyond fear and doubt and personal desire into a state of pure martial dedication that made the mathematics of their deaths irrelevant. Some of the men were like that. The letters they left behind are calm to the point of serenity. They speak of duty and nation and the honor of the sacrifice with a directness that is either deeply genuine or deeply performed, and the distinction matters less than the fact that they wrote it. But many of the letters are something else entirely. Petty Officer 2nd Class Kazushi Hasegawa was 20 years old when he wrote his final letter to his mother in January 1945. He had volunteered 3 times because the program required 3 separate applications before acceptance. His letter does not speak primarily of nation or sacrifice. It speaks of his mother's cooking, of the particular smell of the house he grew up in, of his younger brother, who was 13 and liked to fish. He asked his mother to make sure the brother kept up with his studies. He told her that he had been eating well and sleeping adequately, which was not entirely true. He told her not to worry. He was worried. Not about dying, or not only about dying. He was worried about whether the Kaiten would reach its target. He had practiced the approach dozens of times in the shallow waters of Otsushima Bay. The guidance was imprecise in ways that troubled him technically. The periscope had limited visibility. The depth control required constant manual adjustment. He was a careful, technically minded young man who had been placed inside a weapon with significant engineering limitations, and his letters reflect the specific anxiety of a craftsman who suspects his tools are not equal to the task he has been given. He was right to be worried. The Kaiten's technical limitations were substantial, and they were known to the program's commanders from the beginning. The modified long lance ran on pure oxygen, which gave it range but made it prone to mechanical failure under the stress of manual operation. The depth control was sensitive enough that maintaining proper running depth while simultaneously tracking a target required a level of skill that the abbreviated training program could not reliably produce. The periscope offered a field of view that veterans of the program described as looking through a keyhole while wearing mittens. Of the 106 pilots who launched in confirmed Kaiten missions, the best available evidence suggests that fewer than 15 actually struck their intended targets. The remainder missed, ran aground, experienced mechanical failure, or were destroyed by American anti-submarine forces before reaching their targets. The program's commanders knew the hit rate. They filed it in afteraction reports with the same bureaucratic precision that characterized Japanese naval staff work throughout the war. They did not change the training program in response to the data the way the American Army had changed its training program after Kasserine. They did not convene a board to study the guidance problem. They did not halt operations while engineers addressed the depth control issues. They sent more pilots. And here is the detail that sits at the center of everything, the one that distinguished the Kaiten program from the sacrifice it claimed to represent. The pilots could not abort. The early Kaiten design had no escape hatch. Once the pilot was sealed inside and the weapon launched from the submarine, there was no mechanism to return, no way to surface, no way to signal the mother submarine, no way to exit the torpedo even if the target was never located and the oxygen supply began to run out. A later modification added a theoretically functional escape hatch. It required the pilot to exit at depth, a process that would have been survivable only under specific conditions of pressure and current that the open ocean rarely provided. No Kaiten pilot is known to have used it successfully. The men who sat inside those tubes and waited for a target they might or might not find were not dying in a moment of martial decision. They were sitting in darkness, breathing oxygen that was slowly depleting, managing instruments that were imprecise, in a machine from which there was no return, for hours, waiting. What they thought about during those hours, we know from the letters they wrote before they climbed inside. They thought about their families. They thought about the specific textures of their lives before the war. They thought, many of them, about whether it would work, whether the sacrifice would actually accomplish what the program promised. They had been told they were turning the tide of heaven. The tide, as 1945 progressed, was not turning. By the spring of 1945, American forces were at Iwo Jima. They were at Okinawa. The firebombing of Tokyo in March 1945 killed more people in a single night than the atomic bombs would kill in Hiroshima and Nagasaki individually. But the B-29s that dropped those bombs flew from bases that American logistics had built on islands that American forces had taken from Japanese garrisons that had fought, in many cases, to the last man. The Kaiten program was still operating. Between November 1944 and August 1945, Japan launched Kaiten operations from submarines in waters ranging from Ulithi to the waters off Okinawa to the approaches to the Japanese home islands themselves. The operations became increasingly desperate as American anti-submarine capability improved, and the submarines carrying the Kaiten were themselves being sunk before launching. Submarine Y-370 was sunk by American destroyers on February 26, 1945, with 4 Kaiten aboard and their pilots sealed inside. The pilots died with their weapons in a submarine at the bottom of the Philippine Sea, having never launched, having never had the opportunity to attempt the mission they had volunteered 3 times to perform. The total American shipping losses attributed to Kaiten by the most generous accounting were 1 oiler sunk, 1 destroyer escort sunk, and damage to several other vessels. Against this, Japan had lost 106 pilots confirmed killed on missions, an additional number killed in training accidents, and a substantial portion of its remaining submarine fleet. The strategic calculation that Kuroki and Nishina had made in February 1944, that a manned guidance system could solve the torpedo accuracy problem, was not wrong as a technical proposition. A human pilot could in principle correct for evasive action in ways a mechanical guidance system could not. The proposition was not wrong. The implementation was. The training program was too short to develop the precision the guidance limitations required. The submarines carrying the Kaiten were being destroyed before launch with increasing frequency as American anti-submarine forces learned to identify and target the modified I-class boats. The targets available to the program, after Ulithi, were increasingly naval combatants rather than vulnerable support vessels, and naval combatants maneuvered in ways that compounded the Kaiten's guidance problems. The program's commanders had all of this information. The after-action reports were thorough. The data was accurate. They sent more pilots. There is a man whose story sits at the center of this decision. Not one of the pilots, but one of the commanders. And his story deserves to be told with precision because it captures something about the Kaiten program that its official history did not. Vice Admiral Miwa Shigeyoshi commanded the 6th Fleet, the submarine force, from 1944. He had approved the Kaiten program's expansion after Ulithi. He had signed the orders that sent submarines into waters that his intelligence told him were increasingly dangerous. He was not an incompetent officer. He was not cruel in any conventional sense. He was a man trapped inside a system that had generated its own momentum, that had built around the idea of special attack a moral framework so complete that questioning its effectiveness had become, inside the institutional culture of the late-war Imperial Japanese Navy, something close to treason. To say the Kaiten was not working was to say the pilots had died for nothing. To say the pilots had died for nothing was to dishonor the dead. To dishonor the dead was unthinkable. And so the program continued, because stopping it required a kind of institutional honesty that the system had not been built to produce and that the circumstances of 1945 made almost impossible to perform. There is a photograph. You may have seen it without knowing what you were looking at. A young man sits inside the open hatch of a Kaiten torpedo at dockside. He is wearing a white Hachimaki headband. The men standing around him, other sailors, mechanics, officers, are looking at him with expressions that are not easy to categorize. Not pride exactly, not grief exactly. Something that contains both and resolves into neither. The young man in the photograph is smiling. His name was Petty Officer Toyama Matsuo. He was 19 years old. He launched from the submarine I-53 on July 24, 1945, in waters off Okinawa. American records from that date do not document a successful Kaiten strike in those waters. What happened to his weapon after launch is not known. He is one of 106. Yoshinori Kamata was 21. He was a literature student at Kyoto Imperial University before the war. He left behind a journal of 200 pages. The journal is not a warrior's document. It is a young man's document, full of the things young men think about when they have time to think. The novels he had not finished reading, the professor whose lectures he had genuinely loved, a girl whose name he wrote once and then crossed out so carefully that the name is still legible beneath the ink. He wrote about Dostoevsky. He wrote about what he believed, on reflection, constituted a meaningful life. He wrote about whether sacrifice constituted meaning, or whether meaning had to be found elsewhere and sacrifice was simply its price. He did not resolve the question. He ran out of pages before he ran out of questions. He launched from I-36 in August 1945, 3 weeks before the surrender. Kenichi Nakao was 22. He had been a mathematics student. His final letter to his father contained a precise calculation of the statistical probability that his Kaiten would achieve a direct strike given the training data he had accumulated. The number he arrived at was not high. He wrote that he had gone over the calculation multiple times and arrived at the same result each time and had decided to go anyway. He did not explain, in the letter, why. Perhaps he thought his father would understand without explanation. Perhaps the explanation was inside the question itself, in the fact that 19-year-olds who have been told by the institutions that formed them that their death is required do not always find, in the weeks before the launch, the clarity of refusal. He launched. He did not return. His target was not identified in American records. These men were not what the official mythology required them to be. They were not beyond doubt and attachment and the specific weight of their own unlived lives. They were young men who had been processed through a system that had convinced them, through the accumulated force of culture and training and institutional expectation and the specific moral architecture of a nation at total war, and that this was what was required of them. They believed it. Most of them genuinely believed it, in the way that people believe things they have been told by everyone they trust, in every language available to them, for years. And they climbed inside. August 15th, 1945. The Emperor's voice came through the radio, thin and strange, speaking in a formal register of Japanese that many of the people listening had never heard him use, and some of them could not fully understand. The war was ending. Japan was surrendering. At Otsushima and at the other Kaiten training bases, men who had been preparing for final operations received the news in ways that the historical record captures only partially. Some wept. Some sat in silence for a long time. Some felt, by their own later accounts, and something that was not entirely grief and not entirely relief, and that they spent the rest of their lives finding words for. Ensign Yutaka Yokota had completed Kaiten training. He had been assigned to an operational unit. He had written his final letters. He had not yet launched when the surrender came. He spent the following decades writing about the program, about what it was and what it was not, about the gap between what the pilots had been told and what the records showed, about the specific character of the sacrifice that had been asked of them. He wrote with a precision and a fairness that the subject required and rarely received. He did not condemn the commanders who built the program. He understood the institutional pressures they were operating under. He did not dismiss the pilots who served it as dupes or victims. He understood the genuine conviction that had carried them into those cockpits. What he said, in book after book written over 40 years, was something simpler and harder to argue with. He said the program did not work, and the men who ran it knew it was not working, and they sent more pilots anyway. That sentence is the verdict that the Kaiten program never had to face formally, never had to answer for in any institutional accounting, because the war ended before the accounting could be done, and the aftermath buried the evidence under layers of memorial and grief and the particular kind of institutional silence that protects failed programs from the examination they deserve. The Kaiten pilots are honored today at the Otsushima Museum on the island where they trained. The torpedo that Nishina rode to Ulithi is there, mounted on display, and the letters are there, behind glass, in handwriting that is careful and young. The 3 ships the program sank are noted in the documentation. The 106 pilots are named on the memorial. The comparison is not drawn, not in that museum, not in most of the places where the Kaiten program is discussed inside Japan. The comparison between what was promised and what was achieved, between what was asked and what was received, between the quality of the men who sat inside those weapons and the quality of the decisions made by the men who sent them. That comparison is not comfortable. Comfortable comparisons are not the ones that matter. There is something that the Kaiten program and the American training system, separated by an ocean and a philosophy and everything that the Second World War was fought over, share in common. And it is this: both systems were machines for using human beings in the service of institutional goals. One system was designed to find and develop what was already inside the men it processed, to reveal rather than consume. The other was designed to convert what was inside the men it processed into a specific form of expenditure, to extract rather than reveal. The American system was imperfect. Kasserine showed it. Exercise Tiger showed it. The hedgerow fighting showed it. But the American system, at its structural core, treated failure as information. It changed. It adapted. It was designed, however imperfectly, to keep its men alive long enough to become better at what they were doing. The Kaiten program was designed around a different premise. It was designed around the premise that the math could be solved with sacrifice, that if you sent enough young men into the water inside enough modified torpedoes, the numbers would eventually turn in Japan's favor. The numbers did not turn. Nishina, who had invented the weapon, understood something in his final hours that the institution he served would take decades to acknowledge. He carried his friend Kuroki's ashes to sea because he believed that what they had built together was worth dying for. He believed the weapon would work. He believed the sacrifice would mean something measurable in the outcome of the war. He was wrong about the outcome. He was not wrong about the quality of what he had given. What the Kaiten pilots gave was real, and it was total. What the program gave them in return, the target intelligence, the guidance systems, the training time, the technical solutions that might have made their sacrifice produce results proportionate to its cost, was not equal to what they offered. That asymmetry is the true story of the Kaiten program, not the mythology of turning the tide of heaven. The reality of 106 young men, careful and frightened and convinced and human, sitting in darkness inside sealed metal tubes, waiting for targets that most of them never found. They deserved better tools. They deserved more time. They deserved the honest accounting that the institution that sent them never gave them. They deserved, at minimum, to be remembered as what they actually were. Not symbols, not weapons, not turning tides. Young men who sat inside the mathematics of a war their country was losing and kept going anyway, for reasons that were complicated and genuine and that no official mythology has ever fully captured. That is what they were. That is what the Kaiten program actually produced, not a change in the tide of the Pacific War, but 106 specific human beings who are not interchangeable with each other or with the idea the program made of them. Their names are on the memorial at Otsushima. If this story gave you something to think about, something that will stay past the moment you finish watching, write one of those names in the comments below. Not a general comment, a name. Nishina, Kamata, Nakao, Matsuo, Hasegawa, Yokota, who survived and spent his life bearing witness. Write one name. It is a small thing. It is not nothing. And if you believe that history is better served by what actually happened than by what institutions need to have happened, subscribe, because the next story is waiting. And it will ask the same thing this one asked. Not what the official record says. What was true? If this story hit you, like and subscribe. Every like tells YouTube to show this story to more people. Also, drop your comment here below and tell us where you are watching from. Now, click on this next video. See you there.